Hello, Kiev. I am so sad that I'm not with you in person.
We're too sad to really.
I have you on my bucket list, so I'm going to have to come visit. That my terrible accent isn't going to kill you all. I have to also admit that somehow I spent the past hour listening to the Ukrainian track and was surprised when I refreshed as per Sasha's instructions to discover that there was English interpretation. So I'm kicking myself for my stupidity, but look forward to listening back to the last two presenters again. But here, let me, before I go on, and forgive me if I tell you things that you already know, especially following from the last two great presentations. I thought that what I would do is give a broad, well, start at least by giving a very broad background with a little bit of the bigger picture, and then discuss language recognition, sign language recognition in the Council of Europe territories, and talk about what that means for deaf communities, why that's important. And from there, think through, well, what does that level of recognition or otherwise mean for sign language interpreting? And if we have time, then we can also talk a little bit about COVID-19. I'll be building probably and perhaps even repeating some of what our last wonderful speaker said, by thinking through what COVID has meant for deaf communities, and in particular for visibility of sign language interpreters. And we can think through perhaps also a little bit about what it has meant for sign language interpreter education, where we had to almost overnight move all of our training programs online. So let's see, that's an awful lot to try and pack into 30 minutes, but we'll give it a good attempt and see how we get on. Do you know, it's also really terrible that I can't see all your lovely faces sitting there in the sunshine in that beautiful wood. I'm very envious. Okay. The World Federation, to take the big global picture, let's start by talking briefly about the World Federation of the Deaf. Their grand mission is to reach a stage where deaf people have full human rights in an equal world where they and their sign languages are recognised and included as part of human diversity. Now, in a European context, the European deaf-led organisation called the European Union of the Deaf, they're affiliated to WFD. They also have the same general aims. Top of their list of items that they want to achieve is the recognition of national sign languages on an equal footing with the respective spoken languages of European. They also want a number of things, such as tuition provided to family members to ensure that deaf and hard of hearing children can fully participate in family life, because the majority of deaf people are born into families where everybody else is hearing. Only 5 to 10% of the world's deaf children are born into deaf families. So only that cohort have a real opportunity to acquire a sign language as a native language, in parallel with the kinds of transmission that occurs through mother tongue acquisition in general. They also want to make sure that sign language users have access to public services in their national sign languages, and a number of other things too, like the provision of sign language interpreting services. Some of those things are interrelated. Some of those things happen in isolation. You know, you might not have legal recognition of a sign language, but you may have sign language interpreter provision. Or you may have sign language recognition in a country, but not have any sign language interpreter training programs. So there's a very diverse landscape out there. It may shock you to know that of the world's deaf people, only 3% of deaf children get to go to school and be taught through a sign language. And indeed, the World Federation of the Deaf estimate that something like only 20% of deaf children in the world have access to any education at all. So we have a lot of work to do. but we have come a long way. So here's some rapid fire effects. Just a couple of facts for you. Approximately 1 in 1,000 deaf people are sign language, 1 in 1,000 people, not deaf people, are sign language users. And 1 in 7 people are estimated to have some kind of hearing loss. So that can be an acquired hearing loss, age-associated hearing loss, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a sign language user. And we estimate that for every deaf sign language user, there are approximately 10 hearing signers. And that includes sign language interpreters. I've already mentioned the issue of access to bilingual education, where a language of instruction is a sign language. This is problematic. Indeed, across Europe, when I did a lot of work for about a decade with the European Centre for Modern Languages, we couldn't determine to what degree sign languages were available in schools for the deaf across Europe. There is no one-stop shop that documents that information. It's an issue. The lack of combined, collated data is another one of the challenges that face us. And yet, despite all of that, we do have a number of pan-national, pan-European recognitions of sign languages, including at least 3 from the European Parliament going back to 1988, and also most recently in the Council of Europe in 2019, a resolution on sign languages. And sign languages are also referenced in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This was actually only ratified by Ireland in 2018, but some other European Union countries were even later, which is again shameful. But we are still moving in the right direction. If we think about recognition of sign languages across the Council of Europe states, here's an example of the countries where we either don't have any information available or where the national sign language or sign languages are not yet recognized, because of course there isn't one international sign language, even though we have a thing called international sign, which is a lingua franca that deaf people use to negotiate across sign language borders. And that's quite effective. I do know that Ukraine has a 2011 Act on Social Protection of Persons with Disabilities, but I don't know any more than that, and I would love to find out more. That would be a question I would be asking you around the campfire if I were with you in person. But what about where are we at with the teaching, learning and assessing of sign languages, which is also really important if we're thinking about the teaching, learning and assessing of sign languages in interpreter education programs and in terms of professional competency to evaluate fitness for practice. Well, again, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of how and where sign languages are taught across Europe. But myself and a Dutch colleague, Beppie van den Bogaard, we tried to do this, building on some previous work by a Finnish colleague, Eva Tupi, in 2019-2020. What we can tell you is that at pan-European level, we have made great strides around putting sign languages on the map and making them visible in Council of Europe documentation. We've done this through taking the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. I don't know if you know this, which is used to describe language competency for spoken languages and is used by many governments, many departments of education across the Council of Europe territories and further afield, including in Japan and in Canada. They're really interested in the work the Council of Europe does in this regard. So we worked with the European Centre for Modern Languages to develop a parallel stream of descriptors for sign languages and road tested them across Council of Europe territories. But then what we also did, and I'm really pleased about this, is we discussed with the Council of Europe the possibility of building in to the same document on equal footing descriptors of spoken and sign languages in their latest publication, the latest update of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which is also called a companion volume. And actually, we've also prepared sign language versions of this, which will go live later in this year. So that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, which gives greater visibility and perhaps will also help in countries where deaf communities are pushing for recognition of their sign languages, to see that at Council of Europe level, these things are being taken very seriously indeed. Why does this matter? Well, I've been working with deaf communities now for 30 years. I'm getting old. I'm also a linguist as well as an interpreter. And when I started working with the Irish Deaf Society to campaign for Irish Sign Language recognition, one of the things that politicians would say is, well, demonstrate that this is a real language. Documentation of languages is really important and has turned up again and again in terms of the World Federation of the Deaf and the European Union of the Deaf's work to try and promote recognition of sign languages. And of course, you need to have robust descriptions of languages anyway if you want to train interpreters, because it's not get on the bike and ride it, but you need to know what to do if you need to know of the road, you need to know how these languages package information. So in 2017, finally, we did have legal recognition of Irish Sign Language. It only took about 30 years to get there, but we did. And there was wonderful, joyous celebration on the part of Irish deaf people and our friends around Europe. But there were practical implications. I am getting to talk about interpreters now. Because following from our legislation and many other comparable pieces of legislation, we have reference to interpreting, interpreter education, and interpreter registration and practice. As a result of our Irish Sign Language Act, we now have a register of Irish Sign Language interpreters and an obligation on all public service bodies to provide interpreters for their services, and those interpreters must be members of the register. There isn't the same obligation on private bodies, but that's, I suppose, for another day. We'll get there too. You might be interested in this open access document that I prepared with a colleague, Lucia Venturi, that reviewed the literature on best practice for national and voluntary registers for sign language interpreters. And it also references quite a lot of work on spoken language interpreting registers. So that may or may not be of interest. Another thing that followed for us from the establishment of our register was the recognition of the need to have deaf interpreters. So that is interpreters who are from the deaf community themselves, who are native sign language users, and who bring all the cultural capital that they have, as well as the linguistic capital, to bear on work. These people are going to work in conference settings, perhaps, but also with deaf-blind people, with deaf children, with deaf refugees and migrants. And we're absolutely delighted that we have been able to deliver training to 24 interpreters over the past year who will join the register of Irish Sign Language interpreters this September. I'm just keeping an eye on time here. Okay, so let me say a few things about sign languages in general for you. Because, you know, when we're working between sign languages and spoken languages, we're working between modalities. We're working between, obviously, an oral, verbal language and a visual gestural language. And one of the metaphors that I use that seems to work pretty well, it's not perfect, but it works pretty well, is that I like to think about spoken languages as being spaghetti-like. You know, they have a stream of information that's packaged word after word in terms of their syntax, but sign languages instead are like lasagna. We layer information, we build information. And perhaps a way of showing this is through a couple of quick little examples. In sign languages, we use space to represent space, and we use motion to represent motion. But we also use the hands, the mouth. You know, often people think sign languages are about the hands, but we're also using the torso, the mouth, the face, as well as the space around the signer in order to articulate information and present perspective, point of view around events that we're describing. We can partition off the body. So here what you can see is this gentleman in the still here was participating in a project that we ran around deaf people's access to healthcare. And he was telling us about a time when he had gone on his holidays to Greece, broken his little finger, gone to hospital, not had an interpreter, and found himself, as described here, being prepped for heart surgery. Because what had happened was there had been another gentleman beside him in the waiting room who had actually eaten before his procedure and was sent home. But no interpreter was provided, and they was a mix-up, and they started to prep this guy for surgery. But what you're seeing is he's using his hand. He's got one hand on his torso and his tummy, and the other hand is what we call a hand shape, and he's showing how his chest was being shaved. Yeah, ahead of this surgery that he wasn't have the surgery, by the way. But here, the hands that are represented, they're not his hands. He didn't shave himself. So we have this partitioning of the body where part of the body represents another actor, but he is the person experiencing the action. And in the next photo, you have one of my colleagues at the Centre for Deaf Studies, Carmel, telling a story about, it's a children's story, but at this point in the story, an owl or a bird of some kind or some creature comes out of a tree, a little hole in a tree, and snaps at a little boy's face. The boy was looking for a runaway pet. And there you go. So again, this is the hand being partitioned off to represent another actor. And it's just a demonstration of the fact that we really are using space to represent space and the signer's body in complex ways to layer up, like lasagna, information, which then for an interpreter working into a spoken language adds an extra dimension in terms of unpacking the salient information and knowing what to present and what not to present in their target language work into, like in my case, mostly English. So there we have that. What else can we say? You know, I'm probably going to skip over that because I'm conscious of time. But if you want to know anything about variation in sign languages, we can come back to this and I can show you how men and women of different ages in Ireland sign days of the week for fun. Could be a quiz for you. So what about interpreting then? Well, across Europe, indeed across many parts of the world, sign language interpreting is very much a profession in development. We know that an increasing number of countries have recognised their sign languages, as we've mentioned, and many do offer interpreter education programmes, but it's very varied. Some is vocational, some is still very short term or ad hoc, some is 3-year bachelor programmes or 4-year bachelor programmes, like in my own country. Some have 4 or 5-year pathways to masters. And so it's highly variable. But many countries don't have any formal training for interpreters. And as a result, that disadvantages deaf communities too. And equally, you know, I mentioned deaf interpreters a few minutes ago. In most countries around the world, there is no formal pathway to education for deaf interpreters or pathways to registration, even in countries where there are registration opportunities available for their hearing counterparts. So there's still a long way to go there too. What this means then is that in many countries there are interpreters and indeed sign language teachers who are expected to operate
від
on a voluntary
вчителів
basis.
і
They broker
перекладачів
information. The interpreters are brokering
жестової
information,
мови
but they
очікують,
will
що
expect
вони
on a voluntary basis.
зможуть
And it also
вільно
means that the deaf community
володіти
members,
мовою,
they have to put an
і
awful lot of effort, an awful lot of
також
labor
дуже багато
into
зусиль
looking for
докладається
interpreters,
спільнотою
ensuring provision. So that
глухих,
brings with it an
щоб
additional element
знайти
of stress and
відповідних
anxiety. The
перекладачів. Це
photograph here,
створює
by the way,
додатковий
is from the
стрес,
University of
додаткову
Malta.
тривожність.
I was
Тут
delighted to be
ми
involved
бачимо
in the delivery
фотографії
of an
із
interpreter training
Мальтійського
program there. Their
університету, Мені було дуже приємно, бо у них була перша програма підготовки, потім довелося перейти в онлайн режим через ковід, але дуже цікаво, що нам вдалося подолати фізичні перешкоди, культурні бар'єри і досягти цілей цієї програми на Мальті. Я вже кілька речей зазначила про роботу, яка ведеться. І я думаю, що багато хто із вас стикалося із роботами Даніеля Жіля, який розробив модель щодо послідовного і синхронного перекладу. І мені дуже подобається ця модель, тому що вона допомагає краще розібратися у всіх цих елементах. І тут ми зараз зосередимося на тій роботі, яку веде спільнота глухих щодо просування цієї своєї роботи і свого права бути перекладачами. Думаю, що ми, як міжнародна спільнота, повинні робити все можливе для підтримки спільноти глухих і не просто сидіти і чекати, поки це все відбудеться, але активно підтримувати і часом очолювати цю їхню роботу. І наостанок, я бачила, що перед цим була промова про важливість і видимість перекладача жестової мови, в тому числі на телебаченні. І от Світова Федерація глухих і Асоціація перекладачів жестової мови нещодавно опублікувала свої вказівки щодо жестової мови. Це відбулося після численних природних катастроф, терористичних актів, в результаті яких побачили, що не враховувалися потреби глухих лише в останню чергу, думали про те, що їм потрібен переклад. І дуже добре, що все ж таки було пролите оце світло на перекладачів жестової мови. Ми бачимо, що уряди різних країн йдуть в правильному напрямку, але не варто припускати, що оцей перекладач на телебаченні чи перекладачка цього уже достатньо. Добре, що перекладач присутній на національному брифінгу, але ж це всього півгодини на день. А що відбувається в решту 23,5 години? Там же теж говориться про важливі речі, в тому числі щодо ковіда, щодо того, чи треба і де треба носити маску, як, де і чому зробити щеплення. В багатьох країнах ця інформація недоступна. Тож, якщо ми бачимо таку невеличку краплинку інформації, не треба припускати собі, що цього вже достатньо. Ми можемо побачити, що завдяки ковіду перекладачі жестової мови стали більш видимими, і ви бачите, що у Бельгії тут вже аж 3 перекладачі одночасно працюють, тому що там 3 мовами говорять в цій країні. Це прекрасна видимість, і це прекрасно, що їх побачили в цей важкий час. Ми також бачимо, що деякі дослідники долучаються до процесу просування жестової мови. Ви бачите постери із Ванкувера, постери, що говорять «Послухайте Найджела». Найджел – це глухий перекладач. І цей жест, який він показує, це і означає дотримання соціальної відстані. І це знову повертає нас до лінгвістичних питань. Є багато прогалин у багатьох країнах. Ведеться активна робота щодо того, щоб забезпечити доступ до різноманітних послуг. Наприклад, в Об'єднаному Королівстві Великобританії, яка часто береться за взірець доступності, зокрема в Англії, довелося навіть судитися із урядом через те, що уряд недостатньо надає перекладу жестовою мовою, і суд присудив, що потрібно здійснювати переклад жестовою мовою на брифінгах. Багато ще праці перед нами. Ми бачимо, що міжнародні організації помічають і зазначають, що всіх людей треба долучати до інформування про питання ковід, в тому числі через переклад жестовою мовою. Також потрібно продовжувати працювати над підняттям обізнаності. Глухі активно працюють над просуванням інформації про те, що перекладачі жестової мови повинні бути на екрані. Вони нікого не відволікають і немає чого тут жартувати, тому що це частина звичайних прав людини. Багато ще роботи належить зробити після ковіда, і ми знаємо, що кількість дівчат і жінок, які страждають від домашнього насилля, дуже сильно підвищилася за останні 15 місяців. Але яким чином отримувати доступ до послуг, яким чином інформувати про це, маючи обмеження в комунікації? І я зараз беру участь у проєкті, який цим займається, який це вивчає, і буду рада надати вам певні посилання на наші ресурси. Отже, ми всі повинні працювати, ми всі повинні докладати відповідних зусиль і робити це разом. Отже, вже підводжу підсумки, сподіваюся, всі раді, що я вклалася в таймінг. У нас цілий ряд можливостей. У зв'язку з ковідом підвищилась обізнаність щодо жестової мови, можливо, це безпрецедентна ситуація в історії, але це все має бути відображено у заходах національного і міжнаціонального рівня, щоб ця робота велася постійно і щоб ми, як спільнота перекладачів на міжнародному рівні, підтримували глухих у цій роботі. Також можна сказати, що жестова мова і освіта жестових перекладачів – це ще величезні можливості щодо участі глухих людей. І вони мають бути в центрі цього процесу. Ми повинні подивитися на цей процес очима глухої людини, щоб цей переклад жестовою мовою розглядався не лише як переклад для глухих, але і те, чим професійно можуть займатися глухі. Отже, на цьому подякую вам нашою ірландською мовою. Дуже рада, що змогла сьогодні бути з вами.
They broker information, the interpreters are brokering information, but they're doing it on a voluntary basis. And it also means that for deaf community members, that they have to put an awful lot of effort, an awful lot of labor into looking for interpreters, ensuring provision, and that brings with it an additional amount of stress and anxiety. The photograph here, by the way, is from the University of Malta. I was delighted to be involved in the delivery of an interpreter training program there, their first, which, of course, because COVID, had to go online. But it was a wonderful opportunity to see how we could actually navigate physical distance, cultural distance, and linguistic distance, and still make sure that we achieved the aims of the state and of the program in Malta. Now, I've said a few things about effort. I've talked about labor. When I'm thinking about interpreting, I think about the effort of interaction. I'm sure many of you, or maybe many of you, have come across the work of Daniel Gilles, a spoken language interpreting colleague and researcher based in France, who has developed the efforts model for consecutive and simultaneous interpreting. I really like that work, and I've built on that by thinking about not just the individual interpreter's efforts in processing information and handling interaction, but also the other stakeholders in an event. And for me here today, I only have time to talk a little bit about the efforts involved for the, in particular, deaf community members who have to continuously push for their rights to participate, their rights for appropriately qualified interpreters, and now in the 21st century, their rights to be interpreters. And I think that we, as an international community, need to do everything we can to support deaf communities in taking their place at the table, and not just sitting at the table, but setting agendas and leading agendas too. Now, our last speaker talked about the issue of interpreting and the responsibility of interpreters in the spotlight and on TV. And I want to just touch on this here, because one of the interesting things that you may or may not know is the World Federation of the Deaf and the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters 5 years ago issued some guidelines for best practices in ensuring access to information before, during, and after emergencies for deaf communities. And this came on the back of numerous natural disasters where deaf people were left out. Not just natural disasters, actually, also terrorist contexts where deaf people were not considered, and therefore the provision of interpreting was an afterthought. One of the things that has been quite remarkable in most countries has been the fact that there has been a spotlight shone on sign language interpreters, and that on the whole, governments seem to be doing the right thing. However, I would also caution that we don't presume that the interpreter on the TV is enough. Think about what I say to Irish people when they say, isn't it great to see sign language interpreters on the national briefings every day? I say, yes, but that's just 30 minutes a day now. What happens for the other 23 and a half hours when you can access information about COVID and governmental responses? And, you know, do I wear a mask? Do I not? What's the current thinking on vaccine X, Y, or Z? Deaf people getting parallel information from. It's simply not available in most countries. So we still have a long way to go. And we need to make sure that when we see a sliver of information provision, that we don't presume that that is in itself enough. Okay, one or two more things and then I will stop. I'm conscious of time. What we can say from COVID is that deaf interpreters were seen. These are our lovely Belgian colleagues. Belgium is a federal state, so they had 3 sign languages: German Sign Language, Flemish Sign Language, and French-Belgian Sign Language. And they had deaf interpreters presenting all of their on-screen information. They got great visibility, and it was wonderful to see them profiled during this period in time. We also had what some academics in the field of deaf studies call deaf gain. That is the additional adoption of deaf culture then were brought back actually into the mainstream. So here in Vancouver, we see posters saying, "Listen to Nigel." Nigel is Nigel Howard, a Canadian deaf interpreter who interpreted the Canadian briefings. And this sign is the sign that has actually cropped up in many sign languages to mean social distancing. And here you also have sort of the additional piece in English added on for you and me. And you can see there's body partitioning going on there if we want to come back to the linguistic piece too. And yet at the same time, there are many gaps, as we said. We touched on this. In many countries, there has been an inordinate amount of effort, coming back to effort on the part of stakeholders, to try and ensure access. The UK, which is normally a bastion of accessibility from our Irish point of view, in England, while Scotland are outstandingly good, in England, the deaf community had to take a case to court to challenge the government's lack of provision of interpreting at live briefings. And that hearing hasn't yet been resolved. And in the United States, a judge ordered the White House to provide sign language interpreters at COVID briefings, despite over 25 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we have a long way to go yet. And we can see that international bodies are still noting and warning that people with disabilities are disregarded in the COVID-19 information awareness campaigns, and they call out the need for consideration of translation and interpretation into sign languages amongst their discussions. We also need to continue to raise awareness. This is more effort because deaf people are the ones who feel obligated to do all of the work to raise awareness about the need for interpreters and why interpreters should be on screen. They're not distracting or unnecessary. And memes that make interpreters the butts of jokes, they're not really helpful if we're thinking about interpreting provision as part of a human rights agenda. And as a last point, I would say, there's so much work to be done following from COVID. We know, for example, that the numbers of particularly women and girls reporting domestic violence increased significantly across the past 18 months. But if you're a deaf woman, how do you access services? How do you begin to tell? We know very little about the situation of deaf women and girls with respect to domestic, sexual and gender-based violence across the world indeed. But I am currently involved in a project that looks at this, and I'd be delighted to tell you more, point you to resources that we're working on there. So effort is something that we all need to be aware of, and we need to try and help reduce that burden of effort where we can, because a burden shared is certainly a burden halved. Really summing up this time, I'm sure the organisers will be delighted. All we can say is we're in an unprecedented moment of opportunity because, in part of COVID, there is greater high-level awareness of sign languages than ever before in history, I believe. But this needs to be translated into national and regional action. And we can't assume that we do it once and it's done and dusted. We need to know that this is recursive work, and we, as the interpreting and translation community internationally, need to support deaf communities in this work. We can also say that sign language and interpreter education plays a significant role in opening up opportunities for engagement and participation for deaf people. But deaf people have to be central to the process of such development and rollout. We need to build back better, I would suggest, with a deaf eye. And we need to ensure that translation and interpreting isn't seen as something for deaf people, but rather something that deaf people too do professionally, and that we can learn from them in oh so many ways. And with that, I will say in Irish, Guramila Mochagat, thank you so very much. I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. And I'm going to try and say Diaku Toby, and I hope I haven't killed your Ukrainian ears with that attempt. Thank you so very much.
Lorraine, thank you so very much. Actually, I wanted to thank you in Ukrainian, but you outdid me there. Anyway, yeah, it was really extremely insightful and so much interesting information. We did run out of our time, so I guess we'll just take one question from the audience if there is one. Are there any questions? Okay, if not, then I'm going to ask that question. Well, as Irish Sign Language is obviously a small language compared to English Sign Language, and the fact that it wasn't really recognized for a while, I was just wondering whether it was impacted a lot by English Sign Language and whether the Irish deaf people had to learn English Sign Language because otherwise they wouldn't be able to communicate. So something about that.
Well, no, Irish Sign Language. First, there isn't such a thing as English Sign Language. There is a British Sign Language which is used in
Yes,
Scotland,
actually, I meant to say British,
Northern
not
Ireland, England, Wales. Yeah, no problem at all.
British as opposed
But
to
so
American Sign
Irish,
Language.
exactly, and Irish Sign Language is completely independent. Irish Sign Language has its historic, well, contemporary. In the 1840s, we have links from that period to French Sign Language. So there's a lot of influence from French Sign Language on Old Irish Sign Language. And then we also have quite a few borrowings from British Sign Language into Irish Sign Language. But no, I mean, while some deaf people are certainly multilingual with British Sign Language and Irish Sign Language amongst their repertoires, not everybody is.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you very much, Lorraine. It was very nice to see you again, and it was a pleasure. And we hope to have you again next year or maybe in a couple of years. And have a great evening.
Absolutely. And you too. And enjoy the woods. It looks gorgeous.
Yeah,
I'm so jealous.
I know. Please come to us next time. Bye-bye.
Definitely.
И у нас сейчас по плану арбузики.
Right, we have